Everybody, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our featured speaker and member of our club for this evening's program, Dr. Mark J. Plotkin. I'll start by quoting the visionary primatologist Jane Goodall, who had this to say about Mark's most recent book, The Amazon, What Everyone Needs to Know. Mark Plotkin has spent decades studying the plants and animals of the Amazon and the cultures of the indigenous people, traditional guardians of the forests. His book, The Amazon, What Everyone Needs to Know, is based on his extensive understanding and love of the area. The Amazon is written in a clear and engaging style and comes at a crucial time, explaining the urgent need of increased conservation efforts as more and more of Amazonia's forests are exploited and destroyed, and as indigenous leaders are silenced. This affects climate change and thus affects us all. I could not recommend it more highly. Dr. Plotkin is one of the world's most accomplished ethnobotanists and conservationists. And just to make sure we are all on the same page, ethnobotany is the study of how people of a particular culture and region make use of indigenous plants and fungi. Many of you may have already seen Mark's terrific TED Talks, or perhaps right now you're listening to his extraordinary podcast, Plants of the Gods. If you're not, I'll put this link in the chat. His academic accomplishments include an undergraduate degree from Harvard University, master's degree in forestry at Yale, and his PhD from Tufts University. He went on to do research under his mentor, the renowned ethnobotanist Richard Evans Schultes at Harvard. His books include, as I mentioned, The Amazon, What Everyone Needs to Know, Tales of a Shaman's Apprentice, Medicine Quest, The Killers Within, The Deadly Rise of Drug-Resistant Bacteria. Mark and his wife Liliana Madrigal formed the Amazon Conservation Team in 1995 to protect the Amazonian rainforest in partnership with indigenous peoples. Mark and Liliana, through the ACT, have worked with over 50 tribal peoples throughout the Amazon to protect and preserve not only the region, but the most threatened species in the Amazon, the indigenous tribes who have lived there for millennia. I want all of you to go to his website, amazonteam.org, and that will show you the incredible work that Mark and his team have accomplished and the essential and important work they continue to do. I want to wrap up this introduction, but I need to add that among the many awards Mark has received, Time Magazine called Mark, quote, an environmental hero for the planet. The Smithsonian Institution has recognized Mark as one of the 35 who've made a difference, and both Mark and Liliana Madrigal were among those chosen as Social Entrepreneurs of the Year by the Skoll Foundation. And last, as Elizabeth mentioned, Mark will be one of the featured experts in the upcoming Fantastic Fungi Global Summit coming to a computer near you on October 15th. I hope all of you will participate in what will be the continuing extraordinary conversation and exploration into the role of fungi as envisioned in Louis Schwartzman's incredible film, Fantastic Fungi. And with that, Dr. Mark J. Plotkin.
Thanks, Rick. Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, Tom. Glad to be here. Nice to meet all the fellow club members, but I got a lot I want to cover, so let's just launch into the talk. I entitled this presentation, Molds, Magic, Myth, and Merlot. And I want to break this into two different pieces. The first, I want to talk about how all of us, me included, have long underestimated the role of fungi in human affairs. I'm trying to redress a bit of that tonight. And then I want to talk about wine as an example of a fungal product, which again is underestimated in terms of its impact on human culture, especially in view of the fact that it is yet another fungal product. So let's go to the first slide. Next, please. This is where it all began. These are the mushrooms collected by my mentor, Richard Schultes, that Rick mentioned, in 1938 in Oaxaca, Mexico. And I guess I might best describe myself as an ethnobotanist who's trying to take the upgrade to become an ethnomycologist. This is the beginning of the psychedelic revolution, the psychedelic renaissance right here. And Thomas's excellent presentation to start the evening, he talked about PCR, the polymerase chain reaction. The polymerase chain reaction was invented by Kary Mullis. And Kary Mullis famously and repeatedly attributed to this discovery Steve. And then after the trip, going down Big Sur on his motorcycle, and that gave him the idea for PCR. Now, what some of you, but undoubtedly not all of you, don't realize is that PCR comes out of LSD, which comes out of fungi. And I'm going to talk more about that in the course of this presentation. Next. But here's a question for you all. Let's make this a little interactive. In the chat, I want you to put down the first gift to humanity from the penicillium fungus. This is penicillium, you see it growing here. And the first person who gets this right, and I'm going to let Elizabeth keep track of who is the first, I'll send a signed copy of my most recent book, The Amazon, from Oxford Press. Blue cheese. Tom got it right. Tom gets the book. Everybody says penicillium. Okay, Tom, since you won the book, my question to you is, what's the most recent major gift from penicillium fungus? I'm putting you on the spot. Next. Next slide, please.
Oh, nice.
Statins. Statins come from penicillium. So penicillium has given us blue cheese, penicillin, and statins. Pretty good record. I have never in my life met a physician who knew that statins came from fungi. Next. Now, as Rick said at the outset, I'm an ethnobotanist. I've spent the better part of the last 4 decades working with indigenous peoples in the Amazon to document the uses of flowering plants. Next. And I've had the honor and privilege of working with some of these guys the whole time, almost 4 decades. And that type of relationship is key to the work that I do in terms of getting them to teach me some of the secrets of the forest and the plants they know. Next. A particular area of interest is that of mind-altering plants. And I guess I have to say mind-altering fungi. This is me with the Yanomami, the so-called fierce people, on the Venezuela-Brazil border. Next. And my mentor Schulte says the difference between an ethnobotanist and an anthropologist is when the shaman points the snuff pipe at you, the anthropologist says, oh, not for me, I'll lose my objectivity, whereas the ethnobotanist says, yee-haw. Next. I was a student of Schulte's for many years, and I want to talk a little bit about him, because if you really want to understand the psychedelic renaissance in context, it really starts with this man. Next. This is Schulte's when I met him in 1974, and I fell under a spell from the very first class. Next. And this is where Schulte's grew up. He was a poor kid from East Boston. His father was German, his mother was English. Now, East Boston at the time was the Irish ghetto. So a kid who had to survive surrounded by hostile tribes had a pretty good grounding in terms of preparation to become an ethnobotanist. Next. He went to Harvard as a work-study student, which is very unusual at the time because most of the kids were rich toffs. Next. He entered Harvard in 1933. He was interested in a career in medicine. And of course, at that point in the 20th century, as is of course for most of history, if not prehistory, medicine and botany were pretty much intertwined. So he figured if he had to do work study, he might as well go to the Botanical Museum and maybe get a head start on his medical career. Next. This was his mentor, Oakes Ames. Ames was a patrician, as were most of the people who kept natural history museums afloat during the Depression. This was 1933. And in Ames's class, next, he said everybody in the class has to do a term paper on a useful plant. Schulte's, being the only work study and student in the class, surrounded by rich kids, had the least time to devote to something like this. So he ran to the back of the classroom and grabbed the shortest, smallest book on the shelf. Well, this is it. This is the actual book. I got this out of the Harvard Library. Mescal, it's about peyote. And Schultes took it home, and he was so enthralled by what he read that he was determined to learn more about this magical cactus. Next. So excellent was the term paper that he did that Ames reached deep into his pockets, because this was what rich people did in the Depression to support good stuff, and sent Schultes to Anadarko, Oklahoma, the home of the Kiowa peoples, to do peyote in a ritual setting. Next. So this is the actual collection that Schultes came back with from that expedition. Next. And this is the roadman, actually the shaman, in the middle of the two white boys who went to experience peyote. Schultes on the left and Weston Labar on the right, who went on to become a famous anthropologist in his own right. And Schultes is such a nerd that after all night in a teepee taking peyote with a shaman, he's not only still wearing his tie, he's wearing a tie clip. I mean, how nerdy can you get? Pretty ironic for somebody who turned in to be the uber jungle explorer portrayed on film by, or elements of him went into the characters of both Sean Connery and Harrison Ford. Next. And of course, mescaline came out of this research. Now you may wonder why I'm talking about peyote to a mycology club, and there's a reason for that. Because in his research on peyote, in the Smithsonian Herbarium, he came across a very interesting letter which had been overlooked by everyone else. At the time, people were wondering about these reports from the conquest of indigenous peoples taking magic mushrooms, hallucinogenic mushrooms. The term didn't exist. In fact, the term magic mushrooms didn't exist till an editor at Life magazine coined it for the Gordon Wasson article in Life magazine in 1957. But a guy named William Safford, who was the reigning ethnobotanist at the time and had done very good work on some other hallucinogenic angiosperms, said there were no magic mushrooms, and this was just the indigenous peoples trying to mislead the friars so they could keep taking their peyote. However, the reports were coming from southern Mexico, which is tropical, and peyote only grows on the Mexico-Texas border in the dry deserts. So Schultes, going through the peyote specimens, found a letter from a very odd Austrian physician who moved to Mexico, and he said, Safford is wrong, that indigenous peoples in southern Mexico and the state of Oaxaca are taking mushrooms for hallucinogenic, healing, and divinatory purposes. Next. And this turned out to be the range of the mushroom. Schultes went to Huautla de Jimenez. I mean, imagine what it was like to get to a place this remote in 1936, and then 1937, 1938. I mean, by plane, by train, by muleback, by foot, this was quite a challenge. But Schultes went. Next. And found the Mazatecs and two other tribes who were indeed taking mushrooms for these purposes. Now remember, at the time, nobody knew there were magic mushrooms outside of reports of Amanita muscaria from Siberia. So this was a major revelation to Western science that this practice, which some had already ruled out as being fictitious or had decided it gone extinct after the conquest, Schultes found that this persisted. Next. And these are the mushrooms that he brought back. And you can see them today at the Farlow Herbarium at Harvard. And I'll get back to the Farlow next. This to me was the launch of the psychedelic renaissance that we're in right now. And it's kind of hard to pick up a newspaper or a magazine these days. At least once a week, there's some article about magic mushrooms causing spiritual experiences. Of course, ethnobotanists look at this and say, duh. Next. So this is the psilocybin, a totally unknown molecule until Albert Hofmann extracted it from these mushrooms that were collected by Schultes and later by Wasson. But think about this in context. By the age of 26, Schultes had brought mescaline and psilocybin to the world. And no less an expert than my pal Paul Stamets refers to psilocybin as the Einstein molecule because they keep finding new therapeutic uses for it. Next. And here's an interesting aside. Again, I said the point of this lecture is to talk about how important fungal products are and how even those of us who love fungi, who eat fungi, who study fungi, still underappreciate their contribution to global society. Schultes and his wife were having dinner in Switzerland with Albert Hoffman, and Dorothy Schultes, Mrs. Schultes, pulled a pill bottle out of her purse and knocked some pills in her hand, and Hoffman said, "Oh, what you got there?" "Oh, Viskin." "Viskin, Dorothy, did you know that I'm the one who first synthesized Viskin, which is the first beta blocker? And I did it in part inspired by the psilocybin I extracted from the mushrooms your husband brought back from Mexico?" So, beta blockers are $1 billion drug, as are statins. Both of them come to us from the fungal world. Next. Now, I tell the story in much more detail in the storybook map on the life and times of Schultes. This is on our website, amazonteam.org. I'll put it in the show notes. But I encourage all of you interested in the history of mushrooms, particularly magic mushrooms, and other entheogens studied by Schultes. Schultes is the man who brought ayahuasca to the outside world as well. So this is definitely worth having a look at. Next. So let's talk about Wasson. Wasson is often considered the father of ethnomycology, the guy who started the psychedelic renaissance. But I think that that's overlooking Schultes' role. Wasson was, in fact, a banker, okay? He was not a trained scientist or even an amateur at the time. Next. And Wasson was on his honeymoon. This is J.P. Morgan, who Wasson was working for at the time of his honeymoon. And I'll get back to J.P. Morgan. It's an interesting side story. Next. Wasson was working for J.P. Morgan and was on his honeymoon with his wife, Valentina. Now, Valentina was a pediatrician, but she was born and raised in Russia. And they're on their honeymoon, and they saw some mushrooms in the woods. This is in the Catskills. And she said, "Oh, goody, we're going to have a great meal tonight." And Wasson said, "Don't touch those deadly toadstools. You'll kill both of us." Well, she knew better. And he was a stubborn old cuss. I knew him at the museum. And so the compromise was she would collect them, she would bring them back, she would cook them, and she would eat them. He wouldn't touch them. And he said, when we woke up the next morning and she was not dead, I decided to learn more. And they launched a major project called Russia, Mushrooms and History to look at the impact of mushrooms on world culture. Next. They decided to try and solve the world's oldest cold case, and that was the murder of the Emperor Claudius, seen here in the BBC series played by Derek Jacobi. According to history, Suetonius Tacitus, Claudius was killed by his wife, Messalina, was it Agrippina? I forget, he had so many wives, by magic, not magic, unmagic mushrooms, deadly mushrooms. Next. So it was Valentina, not Gordon, who decided to write to Robert Graves. Robert Graves was a poet and a classic scholar. Next. And Graves wrote the fictional autobiography of Claudius, I, Claudius, which is a brilliant book. I can't recommend it highly enough. It's one of the greatest books I've ever read. Drawing on these ancient sources, he wrote it as an autobiography. And it was then made into the BBC series, which I also hardly recommend. So Graves was the reigning expert on the life and the death of the Emperor Claudius. So they wrote Graves and said, "We're trying to figure this out. You know, can we work together on this?" Next. Well, they did. And this was eventually published in the Botanical Museum leaflets, where Schultes' original publication on magic mushrooms was The Death of Claudius, Mushrooms for Murderers. And everybody in the club can figure out the solution to this cold case. Next. The death cap. And I recommend the paper published by Wasson, which shows you the reasoning that went into this. I will say this, that Wasson published the paper under his own name that his wife did not give credit. But towards the end of his life, when he donated all of his papers to Harvard, he insisted to be called the Tina and Gordon Wasson Ethnomycological Collection. So the two unsung heroes of ethnomycology in my book are Valentina Wasson and Maria Sabina, the shaman. Next. So meanwhile, Wasson and Graves have this lively correspondence going, and Wasson's trying to think, what else can I figure out in the mushroom world? And Graves sends him a very obscure paper from a pharmaceutical journal that says that not only were mushroom cults real, but they still exist. You got to talk to this guy Schultes at Harvard, who actually went to Oaxaca in the 30s and found this. So Schultes did the work in the late 30s. Graves writes to Wasson in 52. Wasson organizes an expedition with the help of Schultes and ends up in Oaxaca in 1955. Next. There he meets Maria Sabina, one of the greatest shamans, not the only great shaman among the Mazatecs. And amongst the Mazatecs, the shamans are primarily female. Next. He then publishes the story Searching for the Magic Mushroom in Life in 1957 and turbocharges global interest in mushrooms. As I said, we're now living in the psychedelic renaissance, and the Western medical establishment is looking at treating and sometimes curing so-called incurable diseases like PTSD, chronic depression, end-of-life anxiety in cancer patients, obsessive compulsive disorder, schizophrenia. I mean, the doors just keep opening wider. Next. Wasson's collections, Wasson's mushrooms and Schultes mushrooms are housed at the Farlow Herbarium at Harvard, one of the biggest mushroom collections in the world. And here's something cool that I bet people, for the most part, were not aware of. Wasson, when he heard about mushrooms, when he heard about Schultes, was working for J.P. Morgan Jr. Wasson was a banker. J.P. Morgan was a graduate of Harvard. At Harvard, one of the subjects he studied was mycology. When they wanted to build a new building to house the mycology collection, J.P. Morgan was one of the most generous donors. Very shamanic synchronicity. Next. I cover much of this in my podcast, Plants of the Gods. It's available on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, most places you'd look for a podcast that's there. So there's episodes that go into the holy trinity of ethnomycology. There's episodes on Schultes, Life and Times, episodes on ayahuasca. So basically, if you want more information on the stuff that I've been talking about, check out the podcast. Next. So let's talk about medicinal fungi in the Amazon. Okay. In the Amazon, scientists kept hearing about piri piri, a safe and effective female contraceptive. But the plant they were pointed to was a sedge. Sedges are chemically inert. But finally, next, my colleague Glenn Shepard, who lived with the Machi Genghis for years and years and years, found out that in fact it was a sedge, but it was a sedge that was infected by a fungus related to ergot. And next. Research on the fungus that he collected yielded 8 new ergot alkaloids. So that, remember that ergot's still used in modern medicine for childbirth problems, postpartum bleeding, and so to find 8 related alkaloids is very exciting. But ethnobotanists had long been frustrated by not finding mind-altering fungi in use in the Amazon. But in 1981, Wade Davis was working with the Waoranis, the so-called savage people, and they showed him a fungus next, which they used for hallucinogenic purposes. And it wasn't analyzed in the lab till about 3 or 4 years ago, in which they did find, in fact, hallucinogenic principles. So yes, there are new mind-altering substances out there. And yes, I think fungi are the most promising source. Next. But it's the shamans, the medicine men and medicine women who know these plants and these fungi best. And that's where you got to go if you want to seek new healing compounds. We now find hallucinogenic frogs in the Amazon, hallucinogenic fungi in the Amazon, therapeutic plants in the Amazon. So that, yes, it was a hallucinogenic lichen. That again, the doors were opening at the same time we're burning down the house. Next. So I want to finish the presentation this evening with talking about the world's most valuable medicinal plant. When I ask people what's the world's most valuable medicinal plant, the answer usually comes back cannabis or opium. Both are wrong. The wine grape is the world's most valuable medicinal plant, in excess of $300 billion, and it continues to grow. Next. Now, here is the extremely important point that I want you to take home, okay? Grapes to wine to vinegar, we all know that. What changes grapes into wine? It's yeast, it's a fungus. What turns wine into vinegar? Acetobacter, a bacteria. Look at that first arrow. That defines our civilization. That defines our medicine. Fighting bacteria is not something that started when Alexander Fleming stumbled across penicillin in 1929. People have been fighting bacteria as long as there were people, and probably before. And wine was the most important, most effective antibacterial we had for tens of thousands of years, up until Fleming's discovery. And let me read a quote from my late colleague, Guido Magino, that talks about wine, why wine is such an important and effective antibiotic. Remember, in the ancient world, you had three alcoholic beverages. You had mead, made from honey. You had beer, made from starch, typically bread, and you had wine. Now, alcohol kills bacteria, but wine is much, much, much more effective. And here's why. Here's a quote from Magino in a wonderful book called The Healing Hand. The antiseptic power of wine is no myth. Since it cannot depend on alcohol alone, recent research has pinned down the mechanism to the anthocyanins, a subgroup in the large group of polyphenols present in wine. The most important member of this group of compounds as regarding antibacterial effects is also the principal pigment of red wines, malvacide or enoside. There is a colorless equivalent in white wines as well. The pigment is readily present in grapes, but combined with a carbohydrate and not antiseptic. During alcoholic fermentation, it splits free and becomes activated. The fungus is fighting the bacteria. Next. Many people think of the discovery of antibacterials, at least in the wine world, they're attributing it to Louis Pasteur in 1868, I think it was, or 1866. Next. Next slide, please. Louis Pasteur in 1866. But again, this is a fundamental misreading of history, because Louis Pasteur was not the first person to effectively combat bacteria in wine. Next. And here's how I know that. This is terebinth resin. Terebinth resin is best known as the balm of Gilead, but it is an extract of an anacardiaceae, that is the poison ivy family, the mango family, that was used by the ancients in their wines to keep them from spoiling. Next. And if you want to know what wines with Retsina, with this resin taste like, you've all had Retsina, probably only once. The name comes from the resin of this terebinth tree. And this was the first almost universal antibiotic in the ancient world, the ancient Mediterranean, because even though they had no means to understand what was going on in terms of the microbiology, people were using this resin from this tree to fight the bacteria that was in their wine. Next. But a much better story about the origin of Retsina was told to me by a Greek roommate in college. He says, when we prepared for the Battle of Salamis, which I think was 460 BC, we knew we were going to get our butts kicked because there were so many more Persians than there were Greeks. So just to take a sort of proactive revenge, we dumped all this nasty resin into our wine. And then we went out and won the battle. And we were stuck with all this wine with the resin in it, so we just developed a taste for it. Next. But again, wine is not just a drink. Wine is first and foremost a medicine in the ancient world. Calmative, a soporific to put people to sleep. It was the anesthetic. And as I said, it was the antimicrobial par excellence. But I also think of it as the creative juice par excellence, again, thanks to the fungi, thanks to the yeast. Next, why do I call it the world's greatest creative juice? Well, let me cite the ancients. Horace said wine brings to light the hidden secrets of the soul. Put more cynically, next. Horace also said no poem was ever written by a drinker of water. Next. Now, most people associate wine culture and the birth of wine culture with the ancient Greeks and Romans, but nothing could be further from the truth. Next. I was talking to my buddy Jean Goodall about this paper I was working on the history of wine as medicine. And she said, well, you know, wine didn't begin with the Greeks and the Romans. It didn't begin with Homo sapiens. My chimps like to get snoggled. She said, animals in Gombe Stream where I work use plants medicinally, and they like to eat and drink those fermented fruits. Next. And she went on to explain that elephants, chimps, birds, insects are all known to tie one on, to get a buzz on by eating and drinking fermented foods to get at that alcohol. And the food of choice in East Africa is marula fruit, again, and the Anacardiaceae, the mango family, which is what the terebinth resin comes from. And let me show you what it looks like when these animals raid the pantry in terms of fermented marula fruit. Next. Next. Next slide. Good times had by all. Couldn't agree more. So when did our own species start drinking wine? I love this cartoon from the New Yorker. I'm getting woolly mammoth notes. Next. Very clearly, the origin of wine was in the Transcaucasia region. Now, wine grape it naturally occurs throughout temperate Eurasia. So why would it begin in Transcaucasia? Next. This is where Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and easternmost Turkey and northwesternmost Iran come together. Next. Well, it's part of the home range of the wine grape. It's the crossroads of many cultures because it's between two seas, the Black Sea and the Caspian. It's home to cultural diversity. It's got a better climate for wine than the hot and dry deserts to the southwest, and it has better soils than Greece. Again, when people talk about Greece as the home of wine, the soils in Greece are terrible. Greece has no major rivers. It's a pretty crappy place to grow wine compared to most of the surrounding region. Next. And here's the first winery. This is Arini Cave in Armenia. This is about 4000 BC. In the middle of the picture, you see the entrance to the cave, and they found the oldest remains of a winery and the world's oldest shoe. You can read about this on the internet. Next. Armenia has long been associated with the birth of wine. This is from the Apadana, the great meeting conference center, essentially, of the Persian Empire. And these were Armenians bringing wine to honor their king. Next. This is from King Midas's tomb. And I put this in there because we have the technology now to scrape the insides of some of these broken pots and shards and find out exactly what's in them. Next. It's my colleague, Pat McGovern, who essentially invented the science by going into the collections in the basement of the Penn Museum in Philadelphia and scraping out the residue in these pots from King Midas's feast. There was a King Midas, and the University of Pennsylvania excavated his tomb in Turkey in the late 50s. And Pat was not only able to find out what was in the residue, he was able to determine exact proportions. I mean, this is mind-boggling stuff. Next. And he then worked with Dogfish Brewery, Dogfish Head, to create Midas Touch. This is what was served at King Midas's feast, which was a beer and a wine and a mead together. It's really tasty stuff, although you can only drink about one bottle. And it just shows that this technology is just unlocking doors to us understanding the fungal kingdom, the biological kingdom, and allows us to understand and manipulate nature as never before. Next. So just to be clear, wine is alcohol produced by the fermentation of sugar from fruits, that is done by a yeast, that is by a fungus, and beer, alcohol produced by the fermentation of sugar from starches, other yeasts. Once again, these are all gifts of the fungal kingdom. Next. And if you're trying to figure out whether people in these ancient drawings and paintings or carvings, what they're drinking, if they're drinking beer, they're drinking it through a straw, because the way they made beer left all the schmutz floating on the top. And so they're always next shown drinking it with a straw, whereas wine is always drunk from a goblet. Next. This is the oldest depiction of wine drinking. This is the standard of It's on display at the British Museum. This is from about 2600 BC. And you see they're drinking from goblets. So this is the first depiction of drinking beer. And here's why this is important, because this is the royalty. That's the king on the throne at the right. Wine was the drink of royalty, because in the deserts of Mesopotamia, you can't grow wine grapes. This was a luxury. And so wine was the drink of kings, a courtesy of the fungal kingdom. Next. This is Ashurbanipal's feast, where he served 10,000 skins of wine. This is about 2600 BC. This is again in the deserts of Mesopotamia. Again, he was showing off his wealth by having everybody drink wine in the middle of the desert. Next. The Egyptians were totally taken with this. The pharaohs drank wine. There are many Egyptian tomb paintings showing the cultivation, the harvest, the preparation, the stomping of wine. But again, wine didn't grow in the Egyptian desert, but it did go right well in the Nile Delta. And the most famous wine drinker of ancient Egypt will look familiar. Next. King Tut. When they opened his tomb, it was full of wine. And there was not only wine, there was red and white wine, and the bottles were stamped with the name of the vineyard and the vintner. Okay, so this is really getting a start on wine culture very early on. Next. This is what the tomb looked like. There's a recreation. Next. So then we see wine culture moving over to the Greeks. And this is, of course, the story of Jason and the Golden Fleece. I talked about myth being one of the things I want to cover. Next. Jason and the Golden Fleece. Now look at the lower left, that's Greece. And look at Georgia, which is where Jason sailed to meet the people of Colchis and find the Golden Fleece. And I think this is essentially a tribal recollection of the Greeks encountering wine culture and learning the best techniques for cultivation and wine preparation. So I think that this connection between Greece and Georgia was the end of the known world to the Greeks, is a tribal recollection, and wine is the key to the story. Next. Again, and I believe that many religious traditions and many of these myths have a basis in biological and cultural reality, and studying biology helps us understand that better. And I'll give an example shortly. Next. Now, to the Greeks, wine drinking was essentially synonymous with civilization. If you didn't drink wine and you didn't speak Greek, you're a barbarian. You know, wine-related imagery is everywhere in ancient Greece and to the Greek Empire. Remember, the Greeks were the great sailors, and they spread their art and their culture just about everywhere in the known world, at least what was known to them. Next. Next. Now, here's another reason why it's important to study wine history if you want to appreciate the value of fungi and their gift to our species. It's the invention of capitalism, okay? These amphora were everywhere in the ancient world, brought there by the Greeks. They moved this wine around. Now with these side-scanning radar and these deep-sea submersibles, remember underwater archaeology next was done by scuba divers and sponge divers. It could go down to about 100 feet. Now with these new technologies, we're going through the deep and finding things that we never had access before. One Greek shipwreck off the coast of France was found to have 10,000 amphora, which is about 300,000 bottles of wine. So yes, the Greeks were indeed obsessed with wine. And next. And again, so much of Greek artwork focuses on wine drinking because it was such a central part. Some people call it the touchstone of Greek culture. Next. And this is best exemplified by the so-called symposium, which in ancient Greek means something along the lines of drinking together. And these symposia, where the wealthy, educated Greeks would get together and drink themselves silly, it basically laid the foundation of our own civilization. Law, politics, philosophy, and science were supposedly what came out of these symposia. Next. But one of the most important things to remember biogeographically is that Greece is a lousy place to grow wine. Italy was much better. And now with new technologies where we can do the genetic analysis of these ancient tombs, we find out that the ancient Romans weren't so Roman after all. Ancient Romans were a combination of Italian tribes, the Samnites, the Oscans, the Romans, and other people like the Greeks and even the Turks. So the Greeks set out to explore the Mediterranean, find better places to grow wine, find new varieties of wine grapes, and then also to create a market for their products. So much of Western history has been miswritten in terms of the importance of this fungal product that really, in some ways, gave birth to our civilization. Next. Now, the Romans seized on all this with a vengeance. Remember that the Roman world was basically built on the Greek world in terms of architecture, art, drama, literature, philosophy, religion, warfare, and medicine, and viticulture. And the center of the Roman wine trade was Pompeii. Next. It was the main wine producing region for Rome. And again, the Romans looked down on everybody who didn't drink wine. Tacitus wrote, for a drink, the Germans have a horrible brew fermented from barley or wheat, a brew which has only very far removed similarity to wine. Next. And the Emperor Justinian wrote a poem about it. His poem said, the scent of wine was like nectar, while the smell of beer was that of a goat. Next. And when you go to Pompeii, where I'm sure most of you have been, the cultivation and consumption of wine is just ubiquitous on the paintings and the sculpture. Next. They're always portrayed in their symposia, they're always drinking. Next. And again, this is what I mean when I say wine was the birth of capitalism. Wine produced in Pompeii has been found as far afield as Ostia, the old port of Rome, Spain, France, Switzerland, Germany, England, and now we have finds in India. Now, when you're doing business with somebody you'll never see, in other words, none of this face-to-face barter, that's a creation of a banking system. That's a creation of capitalism. So yes, another reason to thank a fungus. Next. How popular was wine? In Pompeii, there's over 100 wine bars. Remember, only about 3/4 to 4/5 of Pompeii has been excavated. So yes, these people were obsessed with wine. And remember that it wasn't safe to drink the water in most places, that wine was safer to drink, and wine is also a water purifier, that Roman soldiers would pour wine into the water before they drink it out of a stream. And how important was wine to the Romans? Here's an epitaph from a Roman tomb that I love. Next. Baths, wine, and sex ruin our bodies. But what makes life worth living except baths, wine, and sex? Next. How were the amphoras sealed? With my understanding, it was beeswax, and they would sometimes use a terebinth resin, which would give them double coverage in terms of preventing the advent of bacteria. Next. So this iconography of wine drinking is found everywhere in the Roman world. This is the Villa of the Mysteries, perhaps the most famous piece of Roman art. And you'll see this again next. Now, this is also the scene of the Eleusinian mystery paintings, which I'm sure many of you have seen. The Eleusinian mysteries, I think, can quite conclusively proven to be derived from ergot. This was proposed by Wasson himself, working with Hoffman and Carl Ruck, a classical scholar at BU. It's been revisited in a wonderful book by Brian Morescu called The Immortality Key, best-selling book. You really, guys, we really should have him talk to the club. He's a wonderful speaker, and he traces it all back to this fungus and says the origin of many religions, including Christianity, needs to be attributed to ergot and the Eleusinian mysteries. This is a particularly poignant wall painting from Pompeii. This is Vesuvius, where many people didn't know it was a volcano, and they planted wine vines all the way up the slopes. This is one of the Roman gods. It might be Hermes, or no, it's probably Dionysus, and he's dressed in grapes. So we later found out why the soil was so rich around Vesuvius. Next. And here's why. This is AD 79. Next. And now with new technologies, people are able to find out exactly what varieties of grape people were growing, and they've recreated them. They're growing and producing next Pompeian wine. And there's that painting from the Villa of the Mysteries. So you can drink what the Romans drank. Next. And again, if you think that this is some sort of arcane study that doesn't tell anything about the ancient world, consider this. The per capita wine drinking in Europe today, the major wine drinking countries in Europe today are Italy, France, and Spain, which was the heart of the Roman Empire. The major per capita consumers of beer are Germany, Austria, Holland, Belgium, and England. Next. The barbarians. And to conclude, wine has also had major impact on our culture in terms of religion. It's certainly part and parcel of Judaism. I can attest to that. Hugh Johnson, who wrote really the best book on the history of wine called The Story of Wine, highly recommended, wrote, Jewish devotion to wine runs through their law and literature. It is the very essence of their civilization. And this is best personified by circumcision. In the old days, until relatively recently, when a child was circumcised, the cut was painted with wine to prevent infection, and a few drops of wine were painted on the little boy's lips as painkiller. So you had it summed up. It was a painkiller and it was an anti-infective. Next. The Bible is shot through with references to wine. May your breasts be like clusters of the vine, and the scent of your breath like apples, and your kisses like the best wine. From the Song of Solomon. Next. It's mentioned in the Bible more than any other plant. So one wag wrote in the Oxford Companion of Wine, the Bible's not suitable reading for teetotalers. And I might point out that Gordon Wasson's father was a preacher, and he was so incensed with fundamentalists trying to claim that the ancients weren't drinking wine, they were drinking grape juice. He wrote a whole book refuting that. So Wasson came to his iconoclasm quite naturally. Next. Who was the first vintner in the Bible? Noah. After the flood, Noah went out and planted wine grapes. Next. Next. And where did Noah's Ark end up? Supposedly Mount Ararat. Now, Mount Ararat is easternmost Turkey. And if you remember from the way I started this lecture, that is where wine cultivation was started. So, here's this biblical tale that may sound not very credible to most of us, but the idea that wine began in this biogeographic region where, in fact, wine began may hold some kernel of truth to it. Next. Wine, Mount Ararat is right on the easternmost Turkish border, right near Armenia and Iran. Next. Of course, Christianity is very much associated with wine. The wine in the wine grape is featured in many of Jesus' parables. The first of them, he turned water into wine. The Last Supper centers on wine. Next. He was given Pascha on the cross, which is aged wine turning to vinegar. Next. And of course, it's still drunk as part of communion today. Next. So wine has not only played a major role in Judaism and Christianity, but many people don't realize that it was a fundamental part of ancient Persia. Next. Hafiz, the greatest Persian poet, wrote songs and poems about the wonders of wine and sex. And of course, you all remember the city that Hafiz was born in. Next. Shiraz. I don't think they drink Shiraz and Shiraz anymore, but that's where it comes from. Next. Now, many of the great physicians in the Dark Ages were the Arabs, people like Avicenna. And at the time, wine had been banned in Islam by Muhammad. And so here are these doctors with this great stuff, which is very curative, but they didn't know what to do. So they invented distillation, because if you just use a little bit of the stuff to treat wounds and maybe have a nip in the process. So the rise of Islam and the banning of wine, in a sense, probably led to distillation, which led to the creation of hard liquor. Talk about unintended consequences. Next. So when we talk about grapes, when we talk about conservation, when we talk about fungi, conservation is an issue. Here's a statistic you should remember. There are 1,368 varieties of grapes that have been made into wine. But today, 80% of the world's wine is made from 20 varieties. This is just like growing a corn in a cornfield in Iowa, in a monoculture. We all know the stupidity and the evils of monoculture, and we're repeating the same mistakes. Next. So when I show people this, they think it's the Amazon on fire, which indeed much of it is, but this is Napa. This is Napa. Next. Climate change. The number 2 cause of carbon being released in the atmosphere is forest destruction, most of which takes place in the tropics. Now, the tropics are where most of the world's fungal diversity lies. The tropics are where the least studied fungi thrive. And we now have the technology to find, utilize, manipulate, and bring to market fungi for therapeutic purposes, or not to market, but just to put it in use in the entheogenic world and all sorts of purposes. But we're destroying our nest, okay? Climate change is being driven by destruction. Destruction is destroying plants and animals and fungi. and it's come home to bite us as well, where Napa is on fire, where California is on fire. So this type of environmental stupidity and destruction has a real price, okay, a real price, and we're paying that price. So all of us who love the natural world, the fungal world, the biological world, it's literally going up in smoke. So it's up to all of us to understand the value of nature, to be able to put it in concrete terms, which is what many hard-pressed decision makers are more likely to listen to than just for aesthetic purposes. But just to conclude, I want to make something clear. To me, conservation is an ethical and a spiritual exercise. We shouldn't do it just because it might have the cure for cancer, or it might have a biodegradable pesticide. But when you're trying to change people's minds, we're very obdurate and stubborn. People to point out that every member of Congress over the age of 50 is taking beta blockers. Every member of Congress over the age of 50 is taking statins, and they come from the fungal world. We need to do a better job of letting these guys know that their well-being in their life and their family and their economic well-being is tied to the biological and the fungal world. Next. Otherwise, it's all going to look like this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mark. We did have some questions come up in chat. I saw you catch some on the fly, but if I can ask you a few more of them. Johnny was asking, in the shamans that you have worked with, are they generally just foraging for plants and mushrooms, or are any of them actually cultivating the products that they're using?
Ethnobotany has some riddles that have not been answered. One is why there's so many hallucinogens in Central and South America and so few in tropical Asia and Africa. Similar plants are there, alkaloids there, they've just never been used. One of my riddles, it's unanswered, is why the indigenous peoples I work with in Central and South America seem to know and use mushrooms so little. If you look in Guatemala and El Salvador, you see the mushroom stones, these stone sculptures with the mushrooms growing out of their heads. It's got to be hallucinogens, but there's nobody there who reports using them. Of course, there was nobody who reported in Oaxaca until Schultes and Wasson went down there. So I'm a bit stymied in knowing why they're not making better use of this. You guys remember Daniel Winkler, who spoke to the club a couple of months ago. I sent Daniel to the Northeast Amazon where I work, and he found many mushrooms in villages that I've worked in for decades, which were A, edible, B, medicinal, or C, all of the above, that the indigenous peoples were not taking or using, at least they claim not to be. So they really don't seem to be very good ethnomycologists. So that's kind of a non-answer, but I'm mystified by it myself.
So it sounds like not only not cultivating much, but also overlooking some of the things that we know they could be using.
Definitely not cultivating it. That was harder to hide than not using it. I mean, look, I'm still going back and they're showing me new plants, which means they've been holding out for 38 years. Okay, so I'm not expecting to fork it all over. But by the same token, you get a pretty good sense of them. And I brought in mycologists like Daniel who interviewed them, and they didn't really know very much.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And do you know how the communities that you have interacted with and kept in touch with have, Johnny was asking, we know a lot of indigenous communities have been particularly affected by COVID. Has that been the case with the folks that you're
Yes.
familiar with?
I want everybody to write down the website, mongabay.com, MONGABAY.com. It's the best rainforest website. It's really the best conservation website. It's independent journalism. I wrote an editorial for them on how COVID was killing indigenous leaders, and it's really taken out some of the most charismatic and most important. The current stats in Brazil are that indigenous peoples are being affected twice as much, or being or killed twice as much by COVID. So absolutely, it's had a very deleterious effect on these people, and these people are the best stewards of the forest. I mean, that's what my organization does. with the Amazon conservation team, we're about protecting biocultural diversity. And we've had the honor and privilege of working with over 100 tribes to improve protection of 80 million acres of ancestral rainforest. But we can't do it if the indigenous peoples are being killed off. So I'm very proud of the fact that we put 35 tons of supplies into the hands of the Indians to help them combat this menace.
And you said the website is Manga Bay?
Mongabay.com, MONGABAY.com. And in fact, if there's questions afterwards, or I need to do a little cheat sheet of references and things I referred to, I can work with you on that. But definitely Mongabay.com, or look at AmazonTeam.org, not com, AmazonTeam.org. That's our organization. More information on that there.
Great, great. So Jim was asking, how did the ancients keep wine from turning to vinegar? And you mentioned the resin as one way. Was that the main thing? Because now we use nitrates, right? And
The resin was the most obvious example because we find it in so many places in so many wines. I mean, we're now finding amphora on the seafloor. We can do a sophisticated enough analysis to know exactly what was in there. For example, a lot of them have healing herbs. And that's very interesting for a variety of reasons. One is, well, were they making the wine healthier, or were they using the wine to kill the taste of bitter herbs, or were they using tasty herbs to improve the taste of the wine? So it's a very interesting field for people looking to make a career in mycology. I think this type of analysis of yeasts and bacteria and fungi, the interplay between them, is a really fertile area for further research. And let me say something else about this. You know, I hear from a lot of students and they say, well, I'm going to go into ethnobotany, but there's not going to be any jobs. And my response is, Jesus Christ, they're capitalizing these psilocybin companies at $1.5 billion, and you don't think there's any money there? You know, maybe you shouldn't go into it. Go to law school. So I think the future for mycology and ethnomycology is phenomenally bright. Although I don't think that, you know, I think the capitalism in its usual form will cause as many problems as it solves. But this idea that, well, I love fungi, but, well, you know, I need a job. How many lawyers are there in this country, and how many mycologists are there? The answer to there's too many lawyers, there's not enough mycologists.
well, and my understanding from talking to a lot of people who study the mycology is finding the people to fund them. So it sounds like you have some ideas that are the non-traditional, sort of not the academic route, but other ways.
Thank you, Megan. Yes, well, this is a longer philosophical thing. I think academia is really in for a lot of trouble as a result of COVID. So I would not advise anybody going to career in academia unless it just totally sings to their soul. But industry is really going to be looking for a lot of mycologists, a lot of ethnobotanists in the future, I think, and I hope, and I'm pretty certain.
Tom McCoy was noticing that the amphora that you were showing look a lot like the Incan vessels that they use for chicha. And he was sort of, you know, wondering upon the coincidence of that, or whether there's some reason that they would be so similar.
You know, when I was a kid, one of the most impactful books I read was Thor Heyerdahl's Kon-Tiki, where he built a balsa raft and sailed to the Pacific, and everybody laughed at him, like, as an amateur, what could he know? Well, this is one of the reasons I'm a member of this club. I love amateurs. They're a lot more fun to deal with than a lot of my fellow PhDs, but that's another conversation. So there was definitely contact between South America and the Pacific. My buddy Paul Cox, fellow ethnobotanist, fellow student of Schultes, when I went off to the Amazon 40 years ago, went off to Polynesia, found that the yams in Polynesia were moved there from South America prior to Columbus. So yes, there was contact. But do I think that because Incas have things shaped like amphora and the Greeks have amphora, that there was some connection there? I've learned never to say never, but I can't trace that. So I think it might well be happenstance.
Could just be that it's a very functional shape. That
exactly. Which it's counterintuitive, because you look at an amphora, you think, this doesn't work for me. Why didn't they just make a damn barrel? But they used it as ballast in ships, and they put sand in the bottom of ships so it wouldn't burn. And amphora were very good, better than wooden barrels, supposedly.
Johnny was also asking about the museum collections that you mentioned and wondering how well the plants and fungi that get stored in museum collections, how well they hold up over time.
You know, I can give you some examples. When Charles Waterton collected curare for the first time in the early 1800s, the specimens ended up at Kew. And when they were tested about 20 or 30 years ago, they were still toxic. When Richard Spruce collected ayahuasca in the 1800s, he brought those back to Kew. When they were tested a couple decades ago, they were still hallucinogenic. So it really depends on the class of compounds. These alkaloids will persist for hundreds of years. But I can take you to the Amazon, slash the bark of a croton tree, and the sap comes out red, and then it turns orange, and then it turns yellow, and then it turns white, and then it turns clear. So you know there's some wild ass chemistry going on. And it's hardly surprising that chemical would not be sitting in the same condition in a herbarium or in a lab for very long.
Right. Yeah. I think I'm through all of the questions that came up in the chat. This has been fantastic. Is there anything else you want to plug or let people know about before we let you go?
Well, I will say this, and this is a lead-in to get Brian Morescu invited as a speaker. Brian was trying to prove that the key to the Eleusinian mysteries was ergot, but he went in the Vatican Museum and the Louvre, and all of the stuff had been washed and put on the shelf. So he realized he had to find specimens that hadn't been cleaned. So he heard about a Greek shrine that was being excavated in northern Spain, and went there, and they not only dug up a chalice, but a jawbone that were full of ergot.
Oh, wow.
So that new technologies are answering these questions. And it's why, if we want to look forward, we also have to look to the past. And I know I've talked fast tonight because I had so much I wanted to cover. I hope I haven't talked too fast, but I'll work with you, Liz, to provide more references. My podcast is a source of infinitely more information on Wasson and Schultes and ayahuasca and magic mushrooms. There's two episodes on ethnomycology. So this was meant to be kind of a greatest hits tour, and not to deal with anything in too great a depth, but there's more information out there. So have at it. And thank you for inviting me.
Excellent. Thank you so much.